kaleidoscopic power of who people are and who God made us into something that's so much less than that. Or even when I hear students say something like, I want to see someone who looks like me to inspire me into a field. While I understand that at some level, I think to myself, what you really want is not someone who looks like you, but someone who thinks like you, who understands the you. I think about missionaries who don't look at all like students who spent years in, say, like Africa, right? But may look white and are white.
Welcome, Bible lovers, to Unscrolled, the podcast of Museum of the Bible, about and around the Bible and the Museum of the Bible. And that's the focus today. We have a very special guest, Dr. Carlos Campo, the CEO of the Museum of the Bible. Started just a few months ago, and we thought it's worthwhile talking to him about his story, the story of the museum, where you think that story is going to go. So we're going to dive right into it. Welcome, Carlos.
Good morning. Thank you.
So you have the first bit more than 90 days under your belt. So if you look back, what are the first observations that you have?
I have a number of observations. I'm always struck by this place, just the edifice itself. It's so beautiful. The architecture, the mood. So many people will come and they'll say, I left with just a feeling of encouragement and almost couldn't define exactly why. So that's one of my takeaways, is how beautiful this place is and how we have to maintain that beauty, because it conveys something about the power of Scripture and the nature of God that I think is really important. I think another one of my takeaways is how diverse the group of people are who come here. I've met Muslim people, I've met people of no faith, people of deep faith, people from the deep South, people from outside the U.S., of course, many Latin Americans. I think I shared with you that we had a group of rabbis from Argentina. It's just Argentine pastors and rabbis, who came together. So all of those things have been some of my takeaways, and truly that we are in a city that is, famous for this Potomac fever. Is that a phrase you've heard? Potomac fever is a phrase that people use to say it's something that people catch when they come to D.C. and they think, I'm not sure how I'm going to like this town, but they catch the fever.
Yeah.
And so I definitely, even in our short time here, caught a little bit of that Potomac fever as well.
Yeah, and we're in a beautiful site. I think some of the camera angles
goodness.
show this, the Capitol in the background.
Incredible.
So this is a stunning view here. We don't want to do a chronological LinkedIn readout of your resume. We're a place of stories. You're a man of stories, so we want to dive into the story behind the man and the title. And there's a few stories, so a few areas that we want to highlight. Family, certainly, the interests away from work. So maybe we do that and then start there. You're Cuban American,
yes,
which I'm sure, or I know that impacted you quite a bit. But your doctorate of English language. So let's unpack that. How did that all come together?
Well, it's interesting because I often tell the story of walking into the first day of class with my students, which, I taught for 15 years or so, and they'd see, Carlos Campo teaching English, and seeing a disconnect. But it's funny, Matthias, because when I taught in Southern Nevada, so many of those students were Latino, and many of them said, we chose your name. That's why we're in this class. We saw the last name Campo, and we came because we thought, it sounds like an Hispanic, maybe we'll come. So, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think one of the things I would want to point out is that growing up as a young kid, I didn't have my father's facility with Spanish. He had this exotic Spanish accent and dark skin, which I don't have. I got my mother's coloring. My point is, as a young man, I've kind of felt like this imposter syndrome, a phrase I wouldn't have known, at 9 or 10. But it's like, you're Carlos. They just calling out the roll, roll call in a classroom is meaningless for a lot of students, but not for me. Because when they called out my name, I felt like that's not me. I wish I were Bill or John, because I didn't identify as a Latino. This whole idea of how do you identify? But I definitely felt like something of an imposter growing up, this disconnect between my father's heritage. And it was silly. I was just a kid and I didn't really understand that every single person, of course, is very different in the way they integrate their histories. And because my father grew up in a household where my mother was, she was born in the U.S., he was learning English. And so he didn't speak Spanish in the house. If we ever heard him speak, it was to his family members, his mom, his dad, his cousins, that sort of thing. So it really was a very unique environment. They were both professional entertainers. And so it took me many years to come to terms with the fullness of the beauty of that background, which included my mother's Irish side and my father's Cuban side.
So tell me a little bit about your parents. Who were they?
Yeah, well, my parents actually met on the Jack Paar television program. My father had a career in, basically he led a Latin band. He was with some dancers and singers for a short time, and then it was the Campo Orchestra. So when Jack Paar started his television program in the 1950s, my mother was an accomplished singer. She and her sister, the Clooney sisters, my mother's sister was Rosemary Clooney, and they were the Clooney sisters for years and years. Rosemary started her own career, and my mom started her career, and really on the Jack Paar show is where they met. So they were both professional entertainers, met on the Jack Paar show. My father's the Cuban band leader. My mother is the girl singer. So when my parents got married, my mother, a very faithful Catholic woman, said, I'm going to settle down and raise this family. That's the life that we had. And my father, you were just talking about your dad wanting to settle down. My father settled down at the Deauville Hotel in Miami, Florida. And for years and years, that's where his band would play. And so when I tell people I took the circuitous route to higher education, neither of my parents graduated from high school. Neither one. But they were incredible learners. My father was a brilliant man, great comic dancer and person. And my mother, would read, the Russian novelists faithfully and read the Word of God. And so I often tell people that they embedded in us a desire to pursue education, even though they had not.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about your mother a little bit. For me, my mother is very important.
Yes.
It's a part of my journey where I got to. And first, the name Clooney rings for some people
Right.
bell, right? There's a connection there, right?
Yes, and it's funny because my cousin George, he was kind of the last on the list among the cousins. A lot of the Clooney kids were involved in show business. People don't know, but, Rosemary was married to Jose Ferrer, and Miguel Ferrer, the eldest son of Rosemary and Jose, very fine actor. And Miguel was in a number of films. And, another one of their children, Rafael Ferrer, is still one of the great voiceover talents in the world. Everyone in America has heard his voice. He was the voice of Bud Light and ESPN. But George, never. George was a jock. He was not involved in any of this or interested in any of it. But he kind of got pulled into it and has been the most successful of all of the kids and cousins from that perspective. And really proud of George because he's an amazingly philanthropic person. And he's very self-effacing too. He never has taken himself too seriously. And so really proud of the work that he's been able to accomplish.
So entertainment is one of the threads.
Yes, it is.
In your family.
It is.
So back to your mom, what part did she play in your upbringing?
Oh my goodness, it's one of these things, Matthias. Here we go. We sit down and how do we unpack a life? It's so hard. But one of the things I think about, you talk about those entertainers. I think about the people with whom my mother lived. Her best friend in the world was a Black woman that she's known since she was 10 years old. Matter of fact, the two of them were dancing in a small town called Maysville, Kentucky, in basically a show window of a shop. So my mother loved to sing and dance, and so did her friend. She went by Pud, and they're dancing in the shop window, and police came by and said, Pud, you can't dance. You're a Black girl dancing on the street. You can't do that.
Wow.
And they were going to cart her off to her parents. And my mother said, if Pud can't dance, I can't dance. I won't dance. And so they literally took them both out of that window. And I say this, Matthias, because you go to that same town, if you go to Maysville, Kentucky today, you will see a mural, which is not so unusual in a small town, but here's what you'll see in that mural. You're going to see my mother's sister, Rosemary, back in a street parade, and who's in a convertible? Well, Pud's best friend was another Black woman that knew Rosemary. She's sitting in the car in this convertible with Rosemary Clooney in 1950, sometime in the 50s. That's unheard of. And I point that out because, there's so much discussion of racial strife in America, and so we're so divided. And I didn't know the gift of my mother's connection, not just to Pud, but to so many entertainers who came from all stripes, all backgrounds. So that gift of not really seeing color as a young man, I think was one of the gifts that she imparted to us. But more than that, my mother was a great reader. She was on radio. These were the days when, you were a professional working in the entertainment field. You had to know your craft. And my mother would read to us, like any mom would read stories. Well, not my mother. She was an Irish woman storyteller. And so, she would read Robinson Crusoe to me as a kid. And, even as an adult, I go back and read Defoe's novel and think, I'm 6 years old and I'm hearing these words pour over my ears. What a gift that was. And that she was a faithful woman who read the scriptures to us as well. So I think about all of those things, her faithfulness. But beyond that, she was one of these people, Matthias. It was kind of embarrassing almost. My friends, even in high school, they would knock on the door, say hello to me, and ask the first question, where's your mother? Because they wanted to be near her. She was one of these people that minute you saw her, she would smile at you. You had no past. Didn't matter what your past was. She loved you, cared for you, and was the best listener I have ever known. And what she taught me about listening is, if you are a great listener, it's because you believe that what that person has to say is important. And it sounds like something, it matters. Sounds like a small thing, but I came to know a God who hears, a God who sees, a God who knows you as an individual. And I saw that it was this gift that God had imparted to my mother to say, this is the very nature of God. God cares about every word you say, right? There are no unimportant words to God, no unimportant people, no unbeloved people. And that was my mother's mantra and way of life.
Mm. What did you take from your dad?
One of the things we talked about was food earlier. Yeah. My father will be in the middle of a meal back in the day, and he would say, "What are we, we're having lunch," and he'd say, "What are we having for dinner?" My dad always did things in concert with food, music, and family. And those are the things that are still threads in my life. My dad, when we did things as a family, always. He used to pick us up on his motorcycle. We were in grade school, and two of my sisters and myself, and my dad would take us to the beach. No towels. No bathing suits. We just stripped down and jump in the water. And, I didn't realize how unusual that was.
That's a way to get to prison today, right?
Yeah, exactly. So my dad had a great sense of humor. Again, never took himself. He was one of the most humble men I've ever met. He always saw himself as the lowest of the low. I was so fortunate, my son, to ever have the ability to be in show business. And he used to brag about me. Here's my son who is a doctor of English, and I cannot speak English, which wasn't true. He spoke perfect Yiddish, my father. Oh. He had his audience mainly were Jewish people who loved Latin music. There's a deep historical connection there that I won't trouble you with. But those are some of the threads that I take away from my father. He was someone who understood the wonder of life. My dad was always a yes kind of, I want to be involved. Yes, I want to go. I want to see. I want to learn. Even the grandkids back in the day when he was still around, he's in his late 80s, and they'd go to the movies at 10 o'clock at night. I'm going. My dad would go. He was part of it.
So education
yes.
and language, two things, and the love for life, for community are some of the things that I draw out. And this combination of language and kind of learning that your mom instilled in you, that's a path that you took. So
it's true.
Education is certainly a theme. When you're above your 30s, like you and I, right? There's sometimes a theme that develops in our lives.
For sure.
And I think education is certainly one. How did you get into that field?
I feel like the sense of wonder that has been instilled in me from my youth is one that I take away. And I think with education, a couple of threads. I told you about my parents. I never thought twice about the fact that I was going to pursue college. And later, as an educator who worked a lot with Hispanic students, that was rare. Matter of fact, it was almost the opposite for a lot of kids. They never contemplated that higher education could be part of their life. Whereas for me, I knew I was going to college. That was something that my parents instilled in me. So that was one thing. Plus, my sister, Carrie, incredible influence on my life, and her husband, Pat, he was working on his doctorate when they got married. And he's always been one that's pushed me. And my sister, Carrie, taught third grade and second grade and was an educator for 40 years. She was the first to go away to college. She was the courageous one who left and went to Texas, to a small Catholic school in Texas. So I think they had a huge influence on my life. I would call them Ma and Pa, even though they're only a few years older than I am. But they definitely encouraged me to continue on with my doctorate. And then some professors, one in particular, Chris Hudgens, who's a dean of the arts and letters at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Chris was always someone who encouraged me and said, Carlos, you need to continue wanting to pursue education. You have talent, and you can actually go somewhere. So
So of all the things you could have
yes,
picked, music,
I know,
acting,
right?
cooking,
Yes, there you go.
you picked English.
Right.
Why is that? Is it kind of a counter to, the struggle that you had as a kid, the roll call?
Well,
What is it?
it's funny you mentioned that because so many psychology friends of mine say, that's why you pursued English, because your father struggling with the language, and here you are, Carlos Campo. You didn't want to have the accent. You wanted to make sure, I used to play a dictionary game with my students and say, if anyone could stump me with a word that they could find in the dictionary that I didn't know, I would give them extra credit.
Wow.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So I don't know if any of that is true. I just loved words. I did. I loved the etymology of words, the science of words. But I did study theater arts. I was going to Carnegie Mellon. You've heard me tell this story. I was going to Carnegie Mellon. I went and auditioned for their theater school. And when I got home, my mother died 3 days later of a cerebral hemorrhage. And I stayed in Las Vegas and got a degree in theater, undergrad degree in theater. And then that professor I mentioned, Chris Hudgens, who was an English professor who had many English courses. Of course, when you get a degree in theater, you still take many English courses. He said, pursue a master's in English, do that. And once I did that, I really realized that while I love theater and still love theater arts, I began studying drama, so closely connected to theater. And that kind of got me on the road to English.
Yeah, you mentioned the loss of your mom, and for me, it happened later in life. For you,
Yes.
pretty early on, and when that happens early on, it can be kind of like a pinnacle, a driving point, or a life changer
It
in
was.
terms of kind of a trajectory of where your life takes. So, where did that take you?
It did. I spent the 2 years after my mother's death really searching. People
Mm,
talk about the dark night of the soul, a work I hadn't read until later in life. But I definitely had those 2 years of searching because my mother was such a faithful Christian
mm,
and a soul winner and just an incredible representative for the Lord. And I just couldn't understand it. Here I am 40 years later, honestly, Matthias, and still feeling like, Lord, we've got to talk when I see you. So but it also, at the end of that time, it's almost as though God and I made a pact. It sounds maybe hyper spiritualized, but it really is true for me. The Lord said to me, I can't use you to the extent that I need to if you stay in this dark place. And he helped lift me out of it. I don't know how else to say it. And this pact was, I'm never going back to that moment. And I'm not saying I've suffered difficult days and certainly had those times where I felt that the Lord and I were struggling, fighting in opposite directions for whatever reason, but never ever came back to that place of darkness, that place where I tell people it was as though I had swallowed an anvil, and that I felt this leadenness about my life for so long, and never came back to that. So I think I've helped people with spiritual depression because I've been able to get through it and come to the other side.
mm.
So that was certainly one of those things. And honestly, this idea of living life to the fullest and understanding that my mother literally went from preparing for my sister's wedding and not really a woman who battled illness, but she had an underlying genetic disease that none of us knew about and took her life. And so certainly this idea of not wanting to leave things unsaid, wanting to connect with people deeply and to let them know my feelings, and kind of dispensing with palaver, kind of useless, empty talk and trivia, and really getting into more serious relationship and thought and discourse. All of that certainly changed when my mother died.
So you chose to become a teacher
Yes.
at some point. Was that driven by it too? And then you made it all the way to be the president of a university, of a college. To walk us through that path.
Well, you hear me laughing about it because it was certainly never my intent.
Yeah.
And, teaching called to me as much as I sought it, because when I pursued a doctorate, very typical, right?
Mm.
Here's cheap labor for universities, right? We've got these doctoral students who can teach, but I stepped into the classroom the first day and realized, boy, this is something I could do forever. And when I tell people I drew this short straw, that's exactly what happened. When one of the English department people couldn't make it to a meeting, someone had to go, and I wound up going because no one else from the English department could make it. But after that meeting, someone who was a leader in the system of higher education who was in the meeting, she sent me a text and said, have you ever thought about administration? You did a nice job in that meeting. Would you consider it? And she actually was a vehicle of sorts, because God implanted something in my mind then to think about it. And so the journey was slower. Some say it was maybe too quick, but I became a department chair and then a dean, and then chief academic officer and president, sort of the typical, at least in those days, route to the presidency, and have loved it. One of the things I liked about it, I still miss the classroom. I do. I miss the classroom. But one of the things I've liked about it is you can see a bigger picture, at least for me, and especially because I work with the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, helping Hispanic students understand how to navigate higher education. That was one of the things that I saw I could have a greater impact as an administrator than I did as a teacher.
So your story, your background, even though you never struggled to identify as such, certainly was a kind of a gate opener and something that you discovered later is something that you can speak into for Hispanic students.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It was really a blessing because I know that how I identify to me is more complex. To me, what I worry about in terms of identity politics and just identity in general is we're distilling the kaleidoscopic power of who people are and who God made us into something that's so much less than that. Or even when I hear students say something like, I want to see someone who looks like me to inspire me into a field. While I understand that at some level, I think to myself, what you really want is not someone who looks like you, but someone who thinks like you, who understands the you. I think about missionaries who don't look at all like students who spent years in, say, like Africa, right? But may look white and are white, but they may not look like you, but they are so much like you that you want to be a part of them as well. You just don't know that. So, I always, when I talk about identity, I of course include my Hispanic heritage, but not as the leading factor of who I am, right? I believe that when you think about who God made us, right? This God of wonders beyond all majesty, there's so much more to me than my Hispanicness. And so even growing up, honestly, there was no brown community then. That wasn't a thing. It was truly something that was created in many ways by marketers and by politicians. And so I want to break free of that a little bit, but also embrace the right kinds of ways to understand my ethnicity and my past.
Yeah, it's interesting, you have a similar experience with me. I
Of
have a little
course.
bit of an accent left, and
Yes.
so it's typically the first conversation or the first topic that comes up,
Right.
and maybe the name, and you don't want to be identified by one
There
characteristic
you go.
of your personality. So I certainly can understand that. We're working our way slowly towards the museum, right? So people may wonder when we're getting to the museum, but I think that's the really interesting part here. And one thing that I hear you talk about a lot is your experience in Vegas and the connection to customer experience. That's
Yes.
a bit pet peeve of yours. I would not, it's actually more. Maybe explain that. What was your experience there?
Well, it's interesting working my way through school. I did. I spent a lot of time waiting tables or working as a valet or as a bellman, those kinds of things. And so much, I learned so much, Matthias, about leadership, honestly, there and the customer experience, because you will humble yourself in those settings. You will, and you must. And so that was one of the things I learned working in customer service. But I also learned audience, right? I talked about my parents with audience. And if you're in customer service, especially because I work with Ritz-Carlton, I work with Disney, I understood the heights of great customer service. What that taught me was the moment you are outwardly focused, and there's a very strong Christian ideal there, isn't there? This idea of you empty yourself and you fill yourself with God's love. It is always outward looking. Lord, how can you use me to touch humanity today? That's a customer service ideal, right? Where you're humble and you're looking out to say, how do I meet the customer's needs before they even know that they need it? I'm there to meet that need. So that was something that was deep in my DNA, if you will, as a person. So when I came to the museum, it was one of the first things that struck me. What's this experience all about? What does a guest to the Museum of the Bible feel when they first walk in those doors? And what should they feel? And how do we ensure that they feel it? And so understanding the customer experience was really important to me when I first came.
So you spend a lot of time on
Oh my
the
goodness.
floor, and you talk
Yes.
to people, and you encourage your leadership to do the same.
Yes.
What do you hear people saying? Well, what do they say?
Well, the first thing is this wonder. If we talk about a thread that follows you through life, wonder has been it for me. And that's one of the things about this museum. They walk in and they see this grand hall, as we call it, and they are filled with wonder. These images of the Sistine Chapel, the way the vaulted ceiling works there is just so extraordinary. And to me, Matthias, it's the takeaway about the museum, isn't it? One of the things that people say is it blew me away, right? Mind blown is
I
on our
didn't know.
website. I didn't know. I had no idea. I thought there'd be some old books here,
Yeah.
some scrolls to unpack, and there's so much more. And so, yes, that's one of the things I'm hearing. I'm also hearing from people that they just don't have the time to get through it all. So the depth and the seriousness, when I think about the museum and what attracted me to it as a board member and now as the CEO, there's a seriousness about the way we treat the Bible. Every great museum has to take its subject very seriously. Hold it up, right? It's inspiring. The muse in museums, you walk into the place, and so there has to be a deep sense of reverence for the subject matter. You go to a museum that features the Constitution, it can't think that is just some rag, So it's that same thing. You walk into the African American Museum, there's a deep reverence for that tradition. You walk into the Museum of the Bible, and there's a deep reverence, and it shouts from every exhibit. That's our hope and our desire. But I also know it takes time. How did the Smithsonian build its reputation to where now you just say the word and people think, oh, that's a serious place? That's the way we want people to think about this museum. Not everyone does today. We opened with some skepticism, and that will follow us for a while. That's okay. Every day we open our doors and have the opportunity to tell people we, in humility, believe that this is a place of transformation. It's a place where this is the book. This is the book of books, most published, most widely spoken about. This was a book that was the most unifying narrative in the history of the world. It's not always seen as that, seen as a divider in many ways. But if you look across culture, if you look across what unifies people today, two things, as a matter of fact, in English-speaking worlds, believe it or not, it's Shakespeare and this book. Those two things are the most two thought about, talked about, understood, and studied almost regions of understanding. So I think that's one of the things that I've taken away from the floor.
I want to come back to
Good.
that unifying
Yes.
character of the Bible later on, but if I take the components of your career that you walked us through, education, entertainment,
Right.
the love for language,
Right.
the love for God's word, it seems kind of the perfect combination of what the CEO of an organization like the Museum of the Bible should be like. So if you take all of this and your time at the board that you spent here, what do you see the museum going? What is your vision? What do you think the trajectory of this place is?
One of the things I see, this idea of a kaleidoscopic God that we serve, that is the central figure in the Bible. And so how do we create a museum experience, both digitally and in person, that reflects that kaleidoscopic God, a God that isn't limited by borders? Right here we are in the capital of the U.S., but this isn't this isn't the National Bible Museum, right? So how do we break the boundaries of ethnicity and culture and country and even these cultural ties that we have? The Bible is bigger than that, stretching us to think more deeply, think more broadly. And I think that's and when I think about the vision, yes, digging into this academic heft and the kaleidoscopic power of the Bible. What I love about this museum is there are people who are contemplatives, who walk in and they want the most quiet and the darkest space in the museum. And they want to just pore over 5 verses that are maybe illuminated or illustrated here. And we have a place for that. And then there are 11-year-old kids who say, I want to go to Washington Revelations and take this ride that combines both scripture, this place, Washington, D.C., with a thrill ride. And so I think to myself how different those experiences are, but we bring them all together here. So part of my vision is how do we continue to do that, both in the digital world and both here as well, and then taking it to the world, and always being a place that's learning and growing. And so I think as I consider the future of the Museum of the Bible, I want to have a plan that gives us a framework, but is not a straitjacket that says it has to be this way. Because one of the things I've learned about this book, about the museum, about the Bible, is it's always going to challenge you about where you stand on things and to think more broadly and differently and more powerfully, because we can only understand that main subject, the God that is the main subject, as far as our limited human capacity will allow us. And so it's multifaceted and growing all the time. It's the diamond book of the world. world that will continue to explore the depths of who you are as you look into it and see that main character and explore who he is.
Hmm. Yeah, the identity of the museum is certainly something that is kind of challenged. There's a lot of
Yes.
people who don't know about the museum, what it is. I just spoke with somebody in the museum world here in DC recently, and he said, the talk of the museum world here is how many Bibles can you stuff into a building, right? So, and then you see the inside story that it takes you 9 days to go through it. It's a combination of an event venue,
Yes.
a museum, an attraction. So there's so many facets of it. So if you chose, you want to maintain all of them, or is there kind of an emphasis that you see for the museum?
I do want to maintain all of them, but that idea of seriousness. So we're serious here about the way we approach the Bible.
Mhm.
There's a seriousness and a humility. I think one of the things that is distancing for a lot of people who may not be a person of faith about a place like the Museum of the Bible is they seem so sure about themselves, right? These Christian people in America just feel like, there's one way, and they quote scriptures, which are right. This idea that, Jesus said that, anyone who comes to the Father must come through me, and so that can be distancing for people. I like the approach the museum has taken is that we hold these truths in humility, right? This idea that this is what we believe, but we don't hold this to lord them over people, because if you come in, we want you to see the scripture anew, whatever your background is, and decide for yourself. Let us present it as faithfully and fully. And we'll never get there because the fullness, there's just a limitation. But striving to be faithful and full in our presentation, I think, is what my hope would be for the museum.
Yeah, I grew up as a little Baptist boy.
Right.
If anybody can claim ownership of the Bible, it's probably the Baptist. That's how I grew up. But joking aside, there's so many different denominations. What is it, 1500? Or there's a
Still counting.
countless denominations specific in the US, and there's so many different expectations of the Bible, what the Bible is, the interpretation of it, and also expectations of the museum.
Yes.
How to deal with the Bible. So this complex construct or environment of expectations from different groups, denominations of what we should do, is there an altar call at the end of it? Should we talk about Jesus because there's Jewish people in here? How does the museum navigate that space?
That's a great question. And we will always face some criticism and some acceptance from those groups, but we can't give in to any of it. We cannot be the museum that's simply dodging criticism and responding to the latest criticism, nor can we be that museum that says, oh, I see, you're from this group. Well, on the third floor in this area, we have something that's dedicated to you. See, to me, that works against the power of the Bible, because the power should speak to all groups in the way that it always has across denominational lines. So the fact that we are non-sectarian, that we will not proselytize, and we are apolitical, that's what we aspire to. There will be times we'll fall into a trap and, oh gosh, we crossed the line, and boy, that really does sound like we're proselytizing, or that feels like we're being a little too political there. And that will happen from time to time. But, in a world that is supposed to be post-truth, we know that Nietzsche said that, there are no facts, only opinions. See, that to me is a bridge too far. There are facts. There is truth. And to me, the depth of all humanity, we are truth pursuers. We are. And we are holding up a book that purports to be the truth. The central character said, I am the way and the truth and the life. That's what he said. So we just lay that out there. And how do we hold it in humility to lay it out there to a community of skeptics, to community of believers? Matthias, I say, that person who goes to a movie and said, oh, I read the book. Not only did I read the book, I know the author. And so talk about a group that walks in the door, so many with such expectations. And they think, gosh, why didn't you say this? Or why didn't you cover this? And we know we will disappoint some people who expect us to be a certain kind of museum. But what I ask of the folks who walk in the door is give us an opportunity to learn and to grow and to not meet all of your expectations, but perhaps to meet some of them as we work and grow. Any great museum does that.
Yeah.
They don't expect a single experience to capture all that it is. So give us a chance in the next exhibition. Give us a chance in the next year to exceed your expectations around another element. And so that's what I'm hoping. We are this living, growing, powerful organism because we believe the book is alive, right?
Yeah.
It's still growing. We're learning from it. We're still digging up these wonderful archaeological finds that help us learn more about it. and hence ourselves.
And as we hear the rumblings in the background and the museum is coming live, it's getting close to 9 o'clock. We're opening here, and we overlook Washington, one of the it's the political capital of not of the country, if not of the whole world.
Yes.
And there's certainly a dimension there in terms of a challenge of our identity as the museum, but as believers, we say we're an apolitical organization, but at the same time, we're called, the Bible speaks into politics. And that's another area that is really difficult to navigate. How do you see the museum speak into that space? What role does it play?
I love this quote from Jesus Christ, who said, he's given a coin and he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to the Lord what is the Lord's. To me, it speaks perfectly to the way we should behave as a museum. There are things we should give to Caesar here, right? There are, and to me, once you step in these doors, you escape from Caesar. In such a political place where there is rancor and division and quarreling, step into the museum as a haven from all of that, because this is a place where I think we can leave Caesar behind as much as we can, right? Caesar plays a role, truly, that one specific Caesar who's named after Julius Caesar at some level speaks into the role of Christ and his own journey. But beyond that, we want to be a beacon, we want to be a haven, and we want to be a great partner here in DC. I think it's one of the things I think a lot about, Matthias, is we want to be known in DC as not an outsider. We're not this outsider place where the museum, the town is so diverse, the museum is a bunch of white evangelicals. That's not true. That's not what we're about. We are about a place that wants to say to Washington, we want to be a great partner. We want to be a great partner in terms of the way that we support the city. We've been meeting with fire chiefs and police chiefs. We're meeting with the mayor coming up this next week, all to say to them, we're here to stay. We want to be a Washington attraction and a Washington partner. When Washington is in distress and Washington is in joy, we want people to know the Museum of the Bible is there. We're a partner here, and we're supporting this town and this region. So, I think if we navigate this well, we'll be seen as someone who tips its hat to Caesar and also says, let's dig in as a partner in this community as well.
Yeah, the Bible speaks about a city on a hill. Is that a
Right.
good characterization of what the museum should be?
I think so. If we do it right, some would say, well, a hill separates you from the rest of the city. We would say if we do this right, people will sense that, hey, you know what? There's something different about that place, and it's positive. They're not trying to push an agenda. In fact, they're trying to be serious and lift up what they think is a really important historical book, a book that has been transformational, has a spiritual component, has a historical component, has so many facets to it. And so that's our hope, that that's the way we'll be seen in the days ahead.
Yeah, Proverbs says the man plans his step, but the Lord establishes his path. So in the spirit of this verse, talking about the next 5 years of
Yes.
the museum, where does do our steps or God's path take us?
Right. Well, I love that verse too, and I think it does say that God gives us rationality to be able to step out and say, we have some plans. And part of those plans are to get more people here. So we want more people to put the Museum of the Bible on their agenda as they are making their plans to come to Washington, D.C. We want more people to say we want to be members. And as members, they join the movement that is the Museum of the Bible, this movement that says we are learning and growing as a community that loves this book. So we want to grow membership, right? These are very concrete plans. We want to establish the museum financially well into the future. So growing the endowment as part of this 5-year plan, Matthias. And certainly looking to 2026 as a year where we celebrate the 250th year of our founding. What role did the Bible play in this founding? I mean, I'm a Shakespearean, right? I look at the 3 first edition King James Bibles that we have, but I also know that King James authorized that translation of the Bible because he was trying to speak to the Puritans to answer their concerns about where the Church of England was going. And he did not answer it to their satisfaction. And some would say that's why we have it in America. That may be, a little bit of a distilled way to see the history, but it certainly played a role in why the Puritans came here. So I want there to be a structure that says, here are some goals that we have for the future, some plans that we have and initiatives we're going to bring with the Dead Sea Scrolls coming, this iconography that we're going to have here at the museum, but also a place that is responsive to God's call and changes that happen in DC and in the world, and how we respond to those as well.
Yeah. It would be a travesty to not mention some of the things that we're excited about here.
Yes.
And I want you to have a chance to talk specifically about the Megiddo mosaic that we in another podcast talk with Dr. Bobby Duke about. And
Good.
I think we're going to have some follow-up conversations with the Israel Antiquities Authority about it. So tell us a little bit about Megiddo, and then I want you to talk about also, you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Magdala stone, actually, that is part of it. So kind of tease people a little bit up on the exciting things happening here, because it's not a static place. It evolves, it changes.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. And yes, this Megiddo mosaic, Megiddo is the location where this mosaic was found, a remarkable find from 20 years ago, but it's never been really made public. Maybe 50, 100 people have seen it. It was buried in a prison, and truly buried, what experts think was, the area around it, Matthias, continued to thrive. But this, which was, some sort of prayer space, a worship space, they call it a prayer hall, maybe even a church is the way a modern Christian might see it. The mosaic is the floor, almost like the carpet of the day. But what we find is that something must have happened. It was a time of persecution. This floor dates to 230 AD. So this is before Constantine makes Christianity the religion of the realm, as it were. So they are operating in a time where there's persecution. And so one of the things we know about this mosaic is that it was intentionally covered up with shards and sand, so that whatever was happening for about a century, what happened around it continued to function, because the archaeology around the space shows that, but not the prayer hall. But for a time, it served as a place of worship for Jesus Christ. And it names him, in the inscription on this floor, it names him as God. The earliest reference to Jesus as God that we have in any form is in this mosaic floor, and it's here now at the museum and opening in less than 2 weeks. So we're really excited about the story that this tells, the idea of who were these Christian women, and this man who was a Roman, who clearly was the main funder of this mosaic.
Centurion. Yeah.
He was a centurion and a convert to Christianity, as these women, of course, were. So what was their history? What was this time like? This is all something that visitors will be able to probe with this remarkable exhibit.
And it's a 20 by 30 size.
It's big.
It's big. It's going to be here in the museum, tells you about the size of space.
Yes, and we're only bringing a portion of it. But yes, we think that every Christian person worldwide should make this a pilgrimage and come see it.
So Dead Sea Scrolls and Magdala Stone.
Oh my goodness!
Wrap us up and tease next year.
Well, what's wonderful about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going to have it for almost a year, the exhibit itself. But what some people don't know, and I didn't realize until I came to the museum, was that it's a rotating exhibit. So even the fragments that we will have of these Dead Sea Scrolls are ones that, if you come to the first day of that exhibit, you will see something different if you come to the last. So that's one of the things that I would say. And then I would say, most people have some understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think gaining a further understanding of their history, how they were discovered, and what they tell us about the remarkable unity of the Bible and how little the Bible has changed. I think one of the most mistaken narratives of contemporary understanding of the Bible is, oh my goodness, it's been translated so many times by so many people. There's no such thing as the Bible, right? The Bible is this telephone game where someone said something years ago, but it's changed so much. We have no idea what the original document said or what the original narrative was. The Dead Sea Scrolls tell a different story. And so that's certainly one of the things that is true. And the Magdala stone, boy, it's so remarkable because many experts, maybe the preponderance of experts who understand this archaeological find, say that Jesus may have truly been preaching in a place where it existed. So, I talk about this Megiddo mosaic as a floor where, some people who knew the disciples perhaps were worshiping in this space. Well, how about this, that a stone is coming to the museum that Jesus may have touched or stood upon or preached near. Boy, that's certainly one that's going to have a remarkable power as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this. I have a
Mm,
25-year-old, as know, and a 18 and a 15-year-old, and the 25-year-old gets it. The 18-year-old and the 15-year-old, you know, if you explain a museum and the pieces that are in there that are not attraction-like that we have here,
right.
you always have to connect it to them, right? And so if you think about kind of a Taylor Swift album that's been signed, or a sports jersey of your favorite artist that still smells like the guy who wore it on the field. And here we have a stone that very, very, very likely Jesus has rolled out the scroll
Isaiah
of
scroll.
Isaiah scroll and read out of it, and to say that's the stone that Jesus touched and preached. That is pretty cool.
I think
So
so.
excited about this too. And you know, typically at the end of a podcast, I was speaking with somebody who referred to their album come out, or their latest website, or a book that they wrote. And in this case, I think honestly say, to understand more about what Carlos is passionate about right now, come to the museum, right?
Thank you.
So we invite you to do that.
Yes.
Come here to see the Megiddo Mosaic opening on September 15th, or next year when the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Magdala Stone come here, and in between a lot of the standing attractions that we have here. So thank you for joining us, Bible lovers, and see you next time at Unscrolled.